Okay, so today's daf kuf kaf chet 128. So we're continuing on with things that we cannot. We're starting at the very top of the page. First words are quoting the Mishnah. The Mishnah talked about items that cannot be moved to make space. Why can't they be moved? They can't be moved because they're muktzeh. So there's two issues here. One issue is tircha, which is we're not allowed to do excessive exertion on Shabbat. So we learned about the limit that you can only move 4 or 5 boxes of a certain size worth of stuff out of the way to make space for people to sit down for hachnasat orchim or for study of Torah. Obviously, you can't just move it around for no reason. It has to be a mitzvah. But that's because of tircha. But there's a separate issue of muktzeh, which is things that are not allowed to be handled anyway. You're not allowed to move them at all. So these are things that are unusable on Shabbat. So something which either for physical reasons is unusable, or for a halachic reason is unusable. So tevel is an example of something which is for halachic reasons unusable. Tevel is untithed produce, meaning to say produce that you have not separated terumah, you haven't separated maaser at all. So we talked in the previous daf about things that were permitted to be moved. Now we're getting into the list of things that are not permitted, and the first one is tevel. So the Gemara says pishita. That is obvious. Why does the Mishnah have to tell you you can't move tevel? Obviously, you're not allowed to eat it. Not even a kohen is allowed to eat it. Nobody's allowed to eat it. So lo tzricha batevel tavul midrabanan shezirao ba'atzitz she'eno nakuf. The answer is that there are certain types of tevel that are only rabbinically tevel. So, for example, if you grow vegetables in a potted, you pot the vegetables rather than planting them in the ground, and atzitz she'eno nakuf means there's no hole in the bottom of the pot. So it's completely artificial, so to speak. It's not connected to the ground, and this grows some vegetables. So those vegetables, any kind of vegetable. So these vegetables you have to separate terumah and maaser, but only midrabanan, only rabbinically required. Biblically, only if it grows out of the ground. So rabbinically, it's rabbinic tevel, and still it's considered muktzeh, even though biblically speaking, min Torah, you'd be allowed to eat this without separating the terumah anyway. But since rabbinically you're not allowed to, it's muktzeh. So the next case was velo ma'aser rishon. You cannot move ma'aser rishon shelo nittelat terumato, which means that if you remember when you give your 10th to the Levi, now the Levi has to take something called terumat ma'aser, or as the Torah calls it, ma'aser mina ma'aser. He has to now take. Let's say you give him 10 bushels of whatever. So now he has to take one of those 10 and give it to a kohen. So he has the maaser, but he didn't separate the part for the kohen yet. So it's the same as tevel. It's untithed. He hasn't done what he needed to do. So the Gemara again asks, pshita, this should be obvious. If it can't be eaten, it can't be moved. So what is the chidush here? What is the novelty here? Answer: Lo tzricha shekdimo bakeri shenatal mimenu maaser velo shenitla mimenu teruma gedola. That what it says is that this is the opposite of the case we had before. We remember the case where the Levi comes along and he collects his maaser before the kohen has a chance to get the teruma. So he actually benefits a slight amount. Because if the farmer had separated for the kohen first, there would have been less. And then when he took 1/10 for the Levi would have gotten a little bit less. Instead, the Levi showed up early, before the kohen, and shehikdimo bashibolim we had before. He came while it was still in the stalks. Yes, so he preempted it. Yeah.
It's not clear with regards to if it cannot be eaten. Is it if it cannot be eaten by anyone, or is it if it cannot be eaten by the person?
That's going to come up later in this Amud. We're going to see.
So
right.
Here there's...
No, actually it's anyone. Because remember yesterday we learned that if the Yisrael has terumah, he's allowed to move it, because even though he's a Yisrael and he can't eat it, it's edible to a kohen.
Right.
So it's okay.
So if anybody can eat it.
Okay. And we're going to see that category is going to expand even more in the upcoming Amud. Okay. So like even animal food, even kohanic food, as long as it's edible to somebody. Now, so the issue here though is you have two cases where normally you're supposed to give terumah before you give maaser. You're supposed to give to the kohen, then to the Levi. In two cases, the Levi preempts the process. He comes and he takes before the kohen. Case one was where he takes before the kohen when it's still in the stalks. It hasn't been processed yet. And he says, you know what? Don't process it. I'll take the raw stuff. I'll take it home and process it. Okay, here, take it. So he's not allowed to do that, but he does that. So in that case, he's not required, the Levi now, to pay the extra terumah that the Yisrael would have paid from that, because the Yisrael's obligation didn't exist yet. The Yisrael only becomes obligated to give terumah when the pile of grain is fully made. In other words, when he's extracted the grain and made it into a pile. So since the Yisrael never became obligated in doing teruma, the Levi who preempts the Yisrael and takes his maaser from the sheaves of grain, from the stalks of grain, he doesn't have to give it either.
In other words, at that point, it's forbidden to everyone.
Right.
Like nobody can touch it.
Nobody can eat it.
It hasn't been not even the Kohen.
Right, not even the Kohen.
It hasn't been given.
It has to be separated and given,
right.
even for the Kohen to be able to eat it. So that's the irony that tevel, even though tevel is a tevel because the Kohen's portion hasn't been taken out, even a Kohen can't eat it, right? Because it has to be separated. That's part of the process. Now, so here we're talking about a different case, which is the Levi shows up. The Yisrael made a pile of grain. So he processed the grain, he extracted it, he piled it. Now he's obligated in both teruma and maaser, right? And the Levi comes and takes his portion first. So what's the halacha in that case? Since the Yisrael had already had his own obligation to give to the Kohen, and the Levi took first, so that means the Levi has to figure out how much of this would have gone to the Kohen for the Yisrael's obligation and how much for my obligation. He has to do both now. So the Gemara says, in that case, so you might have thought like what Rav Papa said to Abaye yesterday, which was that there shouldn't be a difference. That whenever the Levi takes first, he's not obligated to fulfill the requirements that devolved upon the Yisrael. The answer is, Kamashmalan Kedishanele Abaye. That's what Abaye's answer came to tell us, that it does matter when the Levi preempts the Kohen. If the Levi preempts the Kohen while everything is still in the stocks, he's not obligated to give anything extra because he doesn't have to fulfill the Yisrael's obligation because the Yisrael didn't have his obligation yet. However, if he comes and takes the produce before the Kohen when it's already in a pile, so now he has to give his own obligation and the Yisrael's obligation. So even if he gave his own obligation, in other words, what the Mishnah is saying when it says shelo nitla trumato, that this is maaser that didn't have its truma removed. If it were just the regular trumat maaser that the Levi has to give, that would be obvious. But it's adding an additional thing. Even if this Levi had to give not only for himself, but also for the Yisrael, right? Because the Yisrael never gave truma from this part that he took. So still, that's considered like it's untithed until this Levi fulfills, and it makes the whole thing muktzeh. Right. So until the Levi fulfills his own obligation and the Yisrael's obligation, he's not going to be done. Okay, in that case. So that's the chidush there. So now we have the next case.
It doesn't make sense because a big part of it is still allowed for it. If you have this as the entire thing, okay.
Yeah, but it's the same. Yeah, but it's the same idea that tevel is a categorical thing. So it's the same thing. In other words, if
he's allowed to have this,
but he's not. In other words, there has to be an act of separation first.
So
the whole thing is prohibited until you say this is it. Yeah.
Even this.
The whole thing is tevel.
Everybody. So not just this.
The whole thing is no good until he satisfies both teruma obligations. In that case,
okay.
Right? He can't say, "Well, I did mine, so the Yisrael, that's not my problem." No, the Yisrael's you also have to do because the Yisrael that tevuah, that produce was already obligated for the Yisrael's on the Yisrael's behalf before you took it. So now you have to give for the Yisrael and also for yourself.
Okay.
All right. So and until both are done, the whole thing is asur. Even if all you had to separate was one grain, it would still be the whole thing. Yeah. So v'lo maser sheni. So we have maser sheni that wasn't redeemed. So Maser Sheni can only be eaten in Yerushalayim. Or it has to be redeemed on a coin.
He has to go.
Right? He has to redeem it and take the money.
Yeah, it's the option.
Right. So it should be obvious that you can't move it because it's muktzeh, you didn't redeem it. Pshita. That even if it was redeemed but not properly, it's still unredeemed. As we learned. Maaser shepidu al gabe asimon. Rachmana amar v'tzarta kesef biyadecha. Davar sheish bo tzura. That what the Torah tells you, v'tzarta kesef biyadecha. You have to literally, it means you have to wrap the money in your hand. But the rabbis interpret it as tzura. V'tzarta kesef means that it has to be a coin that is minted. It can't just be a piece of silver, like a raw piece of silver. It has to be a minted coin. Okay, so therefore, if you decided to try to redeem your maaser on just regular pieces of silver, a bar of silver, something like that, that wouldn't be good.
It has to be currency.
It has to be currency. It has to be with a tzura on it. So he says, same thing, that you cannot redeem kodashim. You can't. Let's say you have hekdesh, something that you dedicated to the Beit HaMikdash, You were going to give your couch to the Beit HaMikdash. Obviously they'll sell it and they'll use the value. But then you said, no, I decided I love this couch. I want to keep it. So now you want to redeem it, but you say, I'm going to redeem it on this piece of land. I want the Kiddusha from this couch to go onto the piece of land. It doesn't work. It has to be Venatana Kesef V'Kamlo. It has to be movables. So you can only redeem Hekdesh on movables. Maser Sheni, it has to be a minted coin. Hekdesh, it has to be movables. It cannot be land. So therefore, even though you did an act of redeeming it, since the act doesn't count, it's still looked at as unredeemed. And that's why the Mishnah is telling you, in other words, the Gemara is saying that the Mishnah, by giving you a case like Hekdesh that wasn't redeemed, is telling you that there might be a case where you think it's redeemed, but it's really not. So in other words, even if you did a pro forma redemption, but it didn't count, then it's no good. So, it would be mukteh still. So, v'lo aluf, we said that there's this vegetable called luf, or this bean called aluf, that is mukteh because it's inedible. It's inedible in its current state. So, Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbi said, metaltelin et hachatzav, b'pnei shu machal litzvayim. That you can handle chatzav. These are all different kinds of vegetables or legumes of some sort that were fed to these different animals. That because it's food for deer. Via tachardal, mustard. Mipnei shu machal lionim. Because actually doves will eat mustard. Okay? So apparently, it has some animal that will eat it. So this is kind of speaking to your point, that even if it's edible to anybody, or anything, or any creature, it could still be considered a food. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer Af metaltelin shivrei zechuchit meheshu machal linamyot. You can even handle broken glass because ostriches will eat broken glass. I didn't know that, but maybe. He said, Amar le Rabbi Natan. Rabbi Natan said to him, Ela me'ata chavilei zimurot yitaltelu depnei shu machal apilin. According to you, then even bundles of zmurot, even vine bundles. In other words, if you have these vines that are rough and hard, but an elephant would eat it, right? So since an elephant will eat it,
we said
right?
During the Romans there were elephants.
Yeah, they had. That's true. Yeah, I mean, yeah. In the Syrian Greeks, remember the story of Maccabim? They had also elephants. Yeah. They had elephants. Yeah.
Which son got killed by a pill?
I can't remember now. Yeah, one of the sons got killed by by an elephant. He went under the elephant to try to kill the elephant, and it fell on him. Yeah. So anyway, Amar le Rabbi Natan Ela me'ata chayil lismor yataltum heshu machal apilim. So what's the answer? So how far are you going to go? Are you going to say that bundles of vines that you're probably thinking of using for firewood, but they're edible to an elephant?
A dog would eat anything.
Not anything, but yeah. So he says Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel na'amiyot shechiche pilin la shechiche. That there's a difference because ostriches are more common. You might see an ostrich around. You're not going to see an elephant walking around. So therefore, anything which is a commonly occurring animal that you would see, around the neighborhood. Apparently, they had ostriches.
I didn't know that.
I guess that they did. I didn't either. But I guess that they had them around. So he said those, maybe in that time, maybe it changed. But but elephants you don't see walking around, and therefore we don't think about it. In other words, it has to be something common enough that when we look at it, we say, oh, this could be food for an elephant. But if elephants don't live in America, we're not going to look at something and say, oh, that would be food for an elephant, because we would never consider the possibility of seeing an elephant.
Unless you go to the zoo.
Mm-hmm. In which case, you're not allowed to feed them at the zoo because you're not allowed to.
Beautiful leather from Australia.
Do they?
Beautiful.
So the Gemara says, okay, Amar Rav Ashi ela Amemar. Rav Ashi said to Amem. Oh, I'm sorry, skipped. Amar Amemar. Amemar said, "V'hu de'it leina amiyot." I disagree. I say that it's not about whether something is common or not. It's about whether you own it or not. If you own an ostrich, so then it makes sense.
It's relevant to you.
Right, it has to be relevant to you.
Yeah.
So he's saying, okay, he's making the category much more limited. He's saying you can't just look at something and say, oh, that's food for this or that's food for that. It has to be that you have it.
Except that would be impossible to manage.
Right.
I could have to know, is that something that any of my animal would eat? And
no, because it would be what
you touch something is like it's a smoke. You
right.
have to know that.
Well, you'd have to know. Right.
It has to be.
No, it's even Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. But Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is even harder because you have to know what every creature eats.
Yeah, I mean,
Because according to him, even
to actually upkeep that.
So what he's saying is that it can't just be that there are ostriches around. It has to be that you actually have an ostrich, and therefore you have an interest in looking at this as a food because you have an ostrich. But so Rav Ashi says, Amar Rav Ashi la'amemar. So Rav Ashi says to Amemar, but wait, Ela de Kamar le Rabbi Natan le Rabban Shimon beGamliel Chavilei Zimrot Yitaltel mepnei shu machal lepilin Yi'id lepilin Amaylo. So he says to him, wait a second, but according to you, what was Rabbi Natan's objection to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel? His objection was that according to you, vines in a bundle should be food for an elephant. But that's true. If you have an elephant, it is food for the elephant. So if Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is only permitting you to handle broken glass when you have ostriches, he should have said to Rabbi Natan, well, if you have elephants, you can handle vines because you have to feed the elephant. Right, so obviously he can't be talking only in a case where you have that kind of animal. Because if you were talking about a case where you have that kind of animal, then of course anything that's food for an elephant, if you have an elephant, would be acceptable. That's not the question. The question is where you don't have an elephant, do we say, well, since it's food for an elephant, it's not muktzeh. If you actually have an elephant, it's obvious that if you're going to be feeding it, that you'd be allowed to use that. So, therefore he says, Ela ra'oi. He says like this, that it means he's capable, since he's capable of having a pet or an ostrich around. Therefore, he looks at the food as having, as being food for an ostrich. But nobody apparently is ra'oi. He's not considered to be someone who's ra'oi, who's capable of having a pet elephant, which is interesting. I mean, why is that? But that's what the Gemara is saying. The Gemara is saying that we look at it that ra'oi means it's because if you're just saying ra'oi in theory, right, that capable, so okay, go back again and say, well, what is Rabbi Natan's objection to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel? Why doesn't Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel say, well, I am also capable of having an elephant? Right? If it's all about capability, and Rabbi Natan is saying, well, if you're going to say ostrich because you're capable of having an ostrich, what about an elephant? Why doesn't Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel say, yeah, you're right, also an elephant? If I could have an elephant. Why doesn't he answer that? So apparently the Gemara is assuming that it's not within the realm of possibility, that one is not ra'oi, one is not really, it's not really it's typical.
Most people don't have elephants.
Right, most people don't have pet elephants. That's it. Okay, so apparently that's what the Gemara is saying. Although it's also possible to say that maybe it depends. Certain people might be capable, certain people not. But let's assume he means it's not a normal thing for a person to have that. So therefore, we don't really look at you as capable of having a pet elephant. So Amar Abai said, Rabban Shimon Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Akiva Kulho Seviralo Kol Yisrael Bnei Melachim Him, that this principle of Kol Yisrael Bnei Melachim, all of Israel are royalty. So we have 4 Tanaim that say that all Jews are royalty. Where do we see this? Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel had the Amaran. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is the one that we already said, right? Because we said that he's telling us that you're capable of having an ostrich, even though ostriches are not your typical kind of animal, your typical kind of pet, but still, you're ra'oi, a person's ra'oi, they're capable of having it, so even though you might not be the type to have rare pets or anything like that, or before when we talked about, we said earlier about the, in the Mishnah, where he says, even though most people don't have ravens, only the rich people, like Rashi said, only the rich people really have ravens as pets, because it was like people had falcons, it was something cool to have to show a status symbol. So Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is saying, something that is food for a raven, like this loof bean, it's food for a raven, so that even though you don't have a raven and you barely can make ends meet and you're living hand to mouth, but you're really a prince, so you could have a raven pet, and you could have an ostrich, even though it's a rare bird. Let's say you could. Are they really? Oh. Yeah. So they're b'nei melachim.
You know what they do with the leather?
Yeah, you said. Yeah, I didn't know that. So then, so Rabbi Shimon? Where does Rabbi Shimon say that all Jews are princes, even if they don't have any money and they're destitute? We saw this already much earlier in the Masekhet, that when it talked about putting on rose oil on your body. So rose oil, the Mishnah had said that an average person will only use shemen vered, they'll only use the rose oil for medical purposes, so it's obviously for medicinal purposes. But a rich person, b'nei melachim, they use it all the time, so for them it's okay because they would use it just for anything because it's like water to them, right? And then Rabbi Shimon Omer kol yisrael b'nei melachim hem. Anything that's good for princes is good for the Jewish people. So if it's good for them, it's good for us. So if having an ostrich is good for you, is good for Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, then it's good for me. And if having a raven is good for him, it's good for me. It's the same concept. Okay, we don't have class distinction. You could look at this as a very, if you wanted to interpret this sociologically or politically, which I don't think it's intended at all, but if you wanted to look at it as basically saying, halakha doesn't recognize class distinctions. That's basically what they're saying.
But owning an elephant is not necessarily a class distinction.
No, we're forgetting about elephant. We're assuming it's not, because that was the only time people had elephants was like the military would use them to trample people. But it wasn't something that you would have at home. The point here is that not to interpret it in a sociological or necessarily political way. But what they're saying is halakha doesn't recognize class distinction. It doesn't say, there's one halakha for the rich guy and there's one halakha for the poor guy.
But that would also make sense, not because of that. It's because it would be impossible to
define it.
I mean,
but then on the other hand,
rabbi's nightmare.
Yeah, that's true. It would be really complicated. Yeah. Although there is such a thing as hefsed merubah, which we have in halakha, which says that if a person has certain cases in kashrut, but we will rely on a lenient position in kashrut for hefsed merubah because there's a great loss.
Right.
And the poskim say hefsed merubah is relative. What is a big loss to you? What's a big loss to Donald Trump? The catering affair, he paid for a $500,000 wedding. So for one person, that's devastating. The other guy,
too, because relative to just
relative to their finances,
to income, and right.
And I would guess that back then even more, probably more than we're used to in America, there were class distinctions, aristocratic people versus common people, probably even more clearer than we have. So anyway, Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva also subscribe to this idea. The Tanya Zolin Denabraita. Haresh ayunoshin bo 1,000 maneh. So velavush itztala bat kuf maneh. The person owes. So we have a borrower. The borrower. Now there's nothing worse than seeing the guy who owes you money drive up in his brand new BMW, with a suit of an Armani suit, and you're like, you can't. I'm sorry, I can't afford to pay you back, right? So the guy comes and he owes 1,000 maneh, which is a lot of money, and he's wearing a suit. It's 100 maneh. So you say to him, he says, sorry, I can't pay you back. So he's wearing an Armani suit. He can't pay you back. So what's going on? So he says, so the halacha is, it says, mafshitin oto umalbishin oto itzla ru'yalo. We say to him, give us that coat, we're going to sell it to get the money to pay your debts, and you wear something that befits someone who doesn't have any money. Right? Because who are you to wear that suit when you can't pay your debts? So what does the Gemara say? So what does the Mishnah, the Baraita say? Tana mishum Rabbi Yishmael. V'tana mishum Rabbi Akiva. Both Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva in their yeshivot taught the following: Kol Yisrael ru'yin lo ta'itz tala. It's not true. Every Jew is entitled to wear an Armani suit. Every Jew is entitled to wear fancy clothes. We are all b'nei melachim, and we do not take away the guy's coat and make him sell it. Because he's entitled to wear. You can't judge and say, well, since you're poor and you can't afford to pay your debts, we're going to make you sell the suit that you have and pay off your debt and wear a cheap suit because you're poor. We don't force him to do that. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael say that we say to the person, you know what? You're b'nei melachim, you're a prince, you're entitled to wear that suit, and we have to find the money some other way. So you see that this concept exists in, we don't judge people's class and put them in it according to these 4 Tanaim. Chavile kash v'chavile etc. So we said various kinds of bundles that the Mishnah had said. Chavile kash. It said that the bundles of straw and wood and different kinds of branches. It depends. If you put them aside for animal food, you can move them. If they're for firewood, then they're muktzeh, clearly muktzeh. So now the Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan brings a baraita here, Chavilei kash v'chavilei etzim, bundles of straw, bundles of wood, Chavilei zradim, bundles of branches, imit kinan lemachal behema mitatlinotan v'blav in mitatlinotan. So we learned that in the Mishnah already, right? That it depends. If they're for animal food, fine. If they are for firewood, they're muktzeh. Rabban Shimon Gamliel Omer, chavilin, anitalin b'yad echad mutar l'tatlan b'shtei yadayim asur l'tatlan. That even within that category, in other words, even if you put them aside, for animal fodder, Rashi explains that it's a tircha. It's too much of an effort to move around such large bundles. Okay, if you can carry it in one hand, fine. But if it requires two hands to carry it, such a large bundle, it's going to be muktzeh, even if it's animal fodder, because handling that kind of heavy load on Shabbat is a tircha. It's going to take away from your enjoyment of Shabbat. Chavilei si'ah ezov v'koranit. So הכניסן לעצים אין מסתפק מהן בשבת, למאכל בהמה מסתפק מהן בשבת. So these are different kinds of basically spices or herbs that were used, and they were woody type of things, so they could either be thrown in the fire and used as firewood, or they could be eaten. Okay, so as we're going to see later in the Gemara here, it's going to identify all of these. Rashi says the Kabeh Mefareshla is going to explain what these are. So either you could bring them in and you're going to let them dry out and then use them as wood, or you're going to eat them. You're going to snack on these things. They're tasty herb things, or different kinds of herbs that could be eaten. So, like you might think of, let's say, for example, cinnamon as a possibility, or you might think of, for example, mint is going to be one of them. So
there was a tree. You remember in one of the abscess with the sweet. It's like a piece of wood that we ate, which was really sweet. It was licorice. We sucked. Right.
Interesting.
It was delicious.
Yeah. So
listen to the spices.
Yeah. So we have spices here. So right. So it says v'kotem biyad ve'ochem, and he can break off a piece and eat it. He can't use a vessel to cut off the pieces, because that's too much like that's too much like kederech chol. It's like the way of doing something during the week. And Rashi says here, kederech chol, k'de'amran, as we said earlier, hayman deparim silka damelatochen, because it's similar to grinding, to chop something very finely. And the normal way to chop it was to chop it finely, these different spices. So you're not allowed to use a kli, but you could break off a piece. And he says, umolel v'ochem, and he can roll it in his hands. In other words, if there were seeds, he can roll them out of out of where they are in order to extract the seeds and eat the seeds. However, the word harbe in many girsaot doesn't appear. That he just shouldn't use a vessel to extract the seeds. In other words, he shouldn't do it in the way that he would normally do it on the weekday. He should do it in a casual manner. So as Rashi and Rashi has here, we'll get to that in a second actually. So now he says, that's different. Rabbi Yehuda the Chachamim say molel berashe etzba'otav ve'ochel ubelat shelo yimlol biyado harbe kederech shoseh b'chol. The rabbis say that he rolls it on the edge of his fingers as long as he doesn't roll a lot at once. Okay, so what do we say? It's not enough. The way that the first Tana was saying, the way that Rabbi Yehuda was saying was that you could put it as much as you want in your hands, as long as you're not using a vessel, and just roll it in your hand and eat it. The rabbis are saying don't roll a lot at once, only roll a little bit and on the edge of your fingers. So that way there's two ways that we can see that it's different from normal. One is that you're only rolling a little bit at a time, and the other one is that you're doing it with the tips of your fingers in an abnormal way. So this is to distinguish it from dash, from extracting a seed from its husk, which would normally be a melacha on Shabbat. Now Rashi says here, b'miltei Rabbi Yehuda Garsinan, we have a girsa here, molel ve'ochel b'lvat shelo yimlol b'chli harbeh. So he has the word harbeh. V'chachamim omrim molel b'rashet be'otav b'lvat shelo yimlol b'yado harbeh k'derech chol. So he says that's what it says in the Tosefta. D'Rabbanan mahmereh de'bechulei yada asur el b'rashet be'otav. Okay, so he says that the rabbis are more stringent than Rabbi Yehuda, that you have to use the edge of your fingers. Okay, you cannot use the middle of your hand to do it. Now, then we said v'chen ba'amita, so too with amita, v'chen b'pigam, and with pigam, v'chen b'shar minei tvalin, and so too with other kinds of spices. Okay, now the Gemara tries to identify these various spices. Not all of them are understandable to us. A lot of them we don't know what they're talking about anyway, and it doesn't help. So my amita, I wanted to actually look in the Steinsaltz, but Rabbi Reuben is not here today to give us the Steinsaltz to see how he identifies these various items. A lot of times he has interesting botanical information that might shed light and on these questions. My amita ninya. What's amita? Mint. Okay, that one we know. So then
in Arabic it's nana.
Yeah, nana, right.
Ninya.
Yeah, so he has ninya here. Siya. What's siya? Amar Rav Yehuda tzatre. Right? So what that is exactly, Rashi gives us two different French words, which I don't know what they are.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what they correspond to. Does he say
This is rain, Old French savory or aromatic herbs.
Okay,
Savol, it means
Alternative
Ta'im, right? Yeah, so obviously it's some kind of herb, but it's not. Yeah,
there are two alternatives. Like the other one is kind of a meat called in Old French poliol, which is a type of mint.
A type of mint. Okay, so exactly what they are, we might not be able to know, but we get the idea.
Okay,
Then he says ezov.
What's ezov?
Abarta. So it's just another word for hyssop. Ezov, we know what that is. We talked about that before. Koranit is koranita shema. So koranita is just telling you what they called it back in the Talmudic times.
Zatar?
I don't know. Maybe tzatre is zatar. What it said before. It sounds like zatar. Yeah, that could be it. It could be.
And they say some people on the table of Shabbat, salt, wine. The Tari says always either you drink or not.
Really?
Salt, wine, and zatar.
Really?
Some juice.
Huh, interesting.
Juice from the not Morocco, Middle East. Zatar is important.
I didn't know.
Lebanon, Syria.
Yeah, I didn't know.
I don't know about the Iranians if they use zatar.
I don't know. I don't know much about the spices. I only eat the food. What about the person who asked, who wants some koranita? And what he was selling was chashe, which again, I think that it's some kind of plant. We don't know exactly what it was, but it wasn't the same as koranit.
They do hashish from pear or something.
Do they? So he says ela siya tzatre. So rather, siya is the tzatre, like we said before, and ezov abarta, and koranita is chashe. So we don't know exactly what chashe is, but again, it's some other kind of aromatic herb. The point is they were identifying what these terms were in their time. But the main point, the most significant point, is that these items that were sometimes just brought in as wood and to be dried out and thrown in the fire, and other times were brought in as food. On Shabbat, you can break a piece off with your hand. You can roll the seeds out with the tips of your fingers to eat it. But you can't do it in the normal way that you would, because then you have issues of dash, extracting, or tochen, grinding. That was the main point that we had to deal with here. So Itmar, we stated this follows basar maliach. You have salted meat. Mutar l'tatlo b'Shabbat. You can move it around on Shabbat. Basar tafel. What about raw meat that it was not salted? So what do we do with that? So Rav Huna amar mutar l'tatlo. Rav Huna says you could still move it around. Rav Chizda amar asul l'tatlo. Now obviously the reason why you would think that you couldn't move it around is because since it hasn't been salted, it's not edible really, right? It's not really something that can be eaten. So that seems to make sense. But Rav Huna amar mutar l'taltelo. Rav Huna says you can move the meat around. V'ha Rav Huna talmid Rav hava v'Rav Rabbi Yehuda svira le title muktzeh. But how could it be that Rav Huna allows you to move this unsalted meat around on Shabbat? Rav Huna was a student of Rav, and Rav holds like Rav Yehuda when it comes to Rabbi Yehuda when it comes to muktzeh. And he's very stringent. And he says anything which is not designated for Shabbat use, and in this case, not having it salted before is basically a sign that you're not planning on using it for Shabbat, and therefore it should be asur to move it, according to Rabbi Yehuda, who is the stringent one in the category of muktzeh. So how can he allow you to move the raw meat around? Because there are actually two prohibitions of mukteh. Many people don't know this. One is to eat mukteh is prohibited, and to move mukteh is prohibited. So to eat mukteh, you could be more stringent and say, I hold like Rabbi Yehuda that you can only eat things which were designated for Shabbat beforehand. But moving things, I hold like Rabbi Shimon, the lenient opinion. So therefore you're allowed to move this raw meat around on Shabbat. That's the way he answers it. Rav Chizda amar asur. Rav Chizda says you can't move the raw meat that's unsalted around. Asur l'taltelo. Rav Yitzchak bar Ami ikla leber Rav Chizda. But once there was a story that Rav Yitzchak bar Ami came to the house of Rav Chizda. V'chaza hahu bar Avza, and there was a certain goose. They were moving it from the sun into the shade. In other words, the meat was sitting in the sun, and it was being ruined. And what did Rav Chizda say? He says that we see here a financial loss. In other words, I didn't want to lose the person, whoever's goose it was, he didn't want to lose the money. It was a financial loss, so he said, bring it inside. Even though it wasn't edible, and it wasn't salted apparently, and edible for Shabbat, and yet he allowed them to move it in. So Shanei Bar Avzah, the Chazei L'Umtzah, there's a difference. Because the Bar Avzah, the goose, you can actually eat it raw. It could be eaten raw. The meat, you can't eat it raw. But the goose, you could eat it raw. They were able to...
what's whose movement rough is that?
To eat it raw without salt.
That's prohibited.
What?
What does it mean? But Rav Chisda prohibits to eat raw?
Rav Chisda doesn't allow you to move the meat around that's unsalted, but he allows you to move the goose flesh around because he says that people would eat it raw. People would eat it raw without salting it, I guess. A salted fish you're allowed to move, an unsalted fish you're not allowed to move around, apparently because an unsalted fish is something which is inedible. Rashi says, it's not... Yeah, downstairs. Yeah. So he says, it's not fit for anything. And even for dogs, we wouldn't throw it. Okay, we wouldn't give it because we wouldn't have in mind. So the fish that has salt, we would eat it raw. That's done often. Right? However, a fish that's raw and doesn't have any salt on it, first of all, you're not going to eat it because that would be disgusting, and you're not going to throw it to the dogs because you don't usually give the raw fish to the dogs. Apparently, that wasn't done. It was something that you were saving for later. Okay, so basar ben tafel ben maliach mutal taltelo. So here we have a support for Rav Hudna that meat that's raw, whether it is salted or unsalted, you're allowed to move it. Okay, but fish, if it's salted, yes. If it's unsalted, no. It's muktzeh. You can move bones around because you can feed them to dogs. Sometimes you throw bones to the dog. That's where the saying comes, throw me a bone here. Right? The dogs will eat the bones. Basar tafuah, meat that is spoiling, you might feed it to a chaya, to a wild animal. Mayim migulim and mayim migulim is water that was left uncovered overnight. So we're concerned that maybe some kind of snake or some kind of other creature deposited some poison in it. We won't eat it, but we'll feed it to our cat because we don't like cats apparently. We don't care about it. The cat will not die from it. The cat has 9 lives. That's fine. See, that's a raya from the idea that the cat has 9 lives. So he can drink that. So you're allowed to give it to a cat. So all these things you might think are inedible, like the spoiled meat. No, you'll give it to certain animals will eat that. So interesting. Tosafot asks, why don't you just say that you would give spoiled meat to the dogs? That's another question. But the point is that you could give it to certain animals. You could give the uncovered water to your cat, so you're allowed to move it. Rabban Shimon Gamliel disagrees. He says, you know what? You're not allowed to touch this water at all because of the sakana, because of the danger of having it around. You shouldn't even handle it. Because you shouldn't even give it to your cats. You shouldn't. In other words, halachically, it's prohibited to give it to anybody, even to cat, because you're not allowed to keep it around. And since it's halachically prohibited to keep it to give it to anybody, it's also muktzeh, because you're not allowed to use it for anything, not even for your cat, because he says it's a dangerous item and we don't want it around. So now the new Mishnah says, "Kofinet tasal efrochim kedei she'yalu v'yerdu tarnegolet shebarachad ochinotad shetikanes." So he says you can turn a basket over in front of the chicks so that they can climb on it to play. The chicks would play on the basket; they'll walk on the basket. He says, and if a tarnegolet, if a chicken runs away, you can push it until it re-enters the chicken coop. Okay, you're allowed to push it from behind. Midadin agalin usiachin. You're allowed to help the young animals, the young cows, the calves, and the other young animals to walk. Isham midadad bena. A woman is allowed to help her son to walk. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, matai. When is that true? That she can't drag her son along in the public domain. If he's able to walk, she can hold his body and help him walk. Like sometimes the way we do with young kids who can walk, we hold their hands and they walk on their 2 feet, but they can't balance so well. So you can, as long as they can move their feet and walk, they're not like a real infant, but they can actually walk. They just need the help, like when they're around 1 year, a little bit under 1, before pre-walking stage, that stage. So you can help them walk. Same thing with the animals. You can actually hold their bodies and help them to walk. But with the tarnegolet, it says with the chicken, you can only push the chicken. You cannot actually hold its wings and help it walk back in.
Walk a dog on a leash.
That for sure. Yeah. For sure, let walk a dog on leash. So the Amar Rav Yehuda says Amar Rav in the name of Rav. This is again, Sammy's going to remember the famous joke about the animal that falls in the pit. So the animal falls into Amatamayim, falls into the water.
So it's okay.
Yeah. So you can bring pillows and cushions and put it under the animal, and the animal will step up on them and come out. Aval, however, I'm sorry, right, so ve'im alata. So in other words, you put you don't push the animal or pull it. You put these cushions there, and if it walks over them and climbs out, it climbs out. In other words, you can't do anything else. Where is an objection? Why in one Braita does it tell us? Why does Rav Yehuda tell us that Rav said that if an animal falls in, you put the pillows under and give it the opportunity to walk out? But the Braita says you don't do that. You just take care of it where it is and leave it there. Wait till after Shabbat. What's the answer? Look, Asher, no problem. Depends on the situation. In other words, if there's a way to take care of the animal in the condition that it is now, in the pit of water, so you do that. If it's not possible to take care of it there, you can't bring it food or there's nothing available, then you give it the opportunity to walk over the pillows and come out. What about the fact that you are mivatel kelim hechano? You can't put an object in a place. For example, where did we see this idea before? You can't put a vessel under the candle that it's going to drip wax onto the vessel on Shabbat. Why not? Because once the wax drips onto the plate becomes muktzeh. You're not allowed to make something become muktzeh on Shabbat. It's like destroying it. It's soter. It's like destroying. Because now you can't move it. Okay? So, or some say it's like boneh because it's like you made it kavua. You made it fixed in its place because you can't move it. The same idea. In other words, you're affecting it in some fundamental way. And changing its muktzeh status. So how can you put these pillows under the animal that it's going to step on them and make them muktzeh? How can you do it? So the answer is Savar mivatel kli mechano derabanan sar balei chayim deoraita vate deoraita v'dachei derabanan, because the prohibition of mivatel kli mechano, of making an object muktzeh on Shabbat, is rabbinical. It's a rabbinic prohibition. But the prohibition of causing pain to an animal is deoraita. It's a biblical commandment. You have to take care of animals. As it says, azov ta'azov imo. You have to help. If you see your friend that their animal's load is too heavy for them, you have to help them. So you see that it's not just to help your friend, it's also helping the animal, alleviating the burden of the animal. So you see from there that the concept of caring for animals is biblical, and that overrides the rabbinic prohibition of muktzeh. Okay, so now, dochin. So he said the tarnegolet shebarcha. So the chicken that ran away, you can push it back in, but you can't hold its wings and walk it in. So dochin in midadin lo. So it says that you can push it, but you can't walk it. So tanina lahad tanu rabbanan. We learned this already in the following teaching. Midadin behema chayav of bechatzer v'lo tarnegolet. Right, that the rabbi said you can help an animal, a wild animal, or a bird walk in the courtyard, but not the chicken. Tarnegolet may ta'amalo. What's the reason you can't help the chicken? Because Amar Abaye mishum de mekafyan nafsha. Because it lifts itself up. In other words, it's going to jump up into your hands, and then you're going to end up carrying it. So certain animals or birds, you can walk them, they'll walk along the ground. But if you do that with a chicken, that you grab its wings, it's going to jump up, it's going to spring up into your arms, and you're going to end up carrying it, which would be a problem, obviously, of muktzeh if it's in the courtyard. And will be a problem of biblical carrying, if it's in the public domain. So this would be this is the problem with the chickens, because the chickens love to jump into your arms, apparently. So, okay, right. So, Tanech Adam midadin be'ema chayav of bechatzer, avalo bereshut rabim. One Braita says that you're allowed to help the animal, the wild animal, or the bird walk in the courtyard, but not in the reshut rabim, not in the public domain. Va'isha midadait bena Bereshut Harabim, and a woman can walk her child even in the public domain, and certainly in the courtyard. Why? Because he can walk on his own. She's just holding his hands and giving him balance as he walks. Okay, that you're allowed to do. But another bright says in okrin beimach v'chayav v'of bechatzer, aval dochin behen shikansu. That it says you can't pick up an animal or a wild animal or a bird in the courtyard, but you can push them so they enter the courtyard. So there it says push, but it doesn't say you can walk them. It only says push. So which one is it? So wait a second. The Gemara says, "Dochin in." Right? I'm sorry, I skipped. So Hagufa Kasha, it's an intrinsic problem because Amrat and Okrin Aval Didayui Midadinan. Because first you said you can't pick it up, which implies you can't pick it up, but you can walk it along. The Hadar Amrat Dochin in Midadin Lo. Then you say that you can push it, but you can't walk it. So which one is it? The first half seems like it sounds like you can hold its wings, so to speak, or you can hold the animal and lead it and walk it in. You don't have to just push it. But then it says, no, you can push it, implying that you can't walk it. You can only push it. There's a difference. Because if you just push it from behind, you're just sort of nudging it. If you hold the animal and you guide it, that's different.
I was a farmer, chicken farmer.
No. Chickens don't jump into your arms, they don't love you?
They jump.
Yeah, they jump.
You don't have no control.
Yeah, well that's what he's saying. So the Gemara says, what's the difference? So Amar Abaye Sefa'atan the Tarnegolet, that the end of this Mishnah is talking about a Tarnegolet. In other words, there are three categories, or two categories. Any other animal, you can walk them by actually holding their body or holding their wings and leading them. Except for, now you can't pick up any animal. There's no animal that you're allowed to pick up. But you're allowed to walk them and lead them. A Tarnegolet, you can only push. They're downstairs.
How do I get there?
Elevator is the easiest, probably. Yeah. The Tarnegolet, you can't hold its wings because it will hop into your arms. You can only nudge it from behind so that it moves forward to the into the pen or into the chicken coop, wherever it needs to be. So the Amar Abaye says, "Hai man dishachit tarnegolet lechveshinu lekar'e bara." If you slaughter a tarnegolet, you slaughter a chicken. You should make sure to push its feet into the ground so that it can't hop. Okay? Or you should lift it off the ground when you are slaughtering it. Because what will happen is it will resist. In other words, it will push its legs into the ground itself. If you do push them in so that it doesn't have freedom of motion, it can't push its own feet into the ground anymore. But if you let it, it will twist its body around. In other words, it will push its feet into the ground and twist its body around, and then it will end up making itself a terefa when you're trying to slaughter it, because it will uproot. It'll uproot one of the simanim. The simanim are the windpipe and the trachea and the windpipe. You're not allowed to whatchamacallit.
Trachea.
Right. What am I? Right. The kana and the veshet.
Yeah.
So the food pipe and the windpipe, basically. So if you so you have to make sure that it's immobilized. Otherwise, it's going to struggle.
How do you
and uproot.
How do you shot it without lifting it up, without picking it up?
In other words, you can't just have it standing there, hold it, and just do it. You have to either push it into the ground so that it can't struggle, or you have to have it hold, or you have to hold it, or you can pick it up.
Oh, you can?
You could pick it up. He says, do one of the two things. Just don't allow it to have its feet on the ground, because if its feet on the ground, it's going to twist around.
They put the wings and then
Yeah.
the shochet, and then the blood.
Yeah.
I saw it. Nobody used to do that.
Yeah. So, right. So for a chicken, actually, you only have to get one of the simanim, but both of this, if neither of the simanim is correctly slaughtered, so then you have a problem. So now, you can't birth an animal on Yom Tov. In other words, you can't be their OBGYN. Okay? Aval misa'adin, but you can assist. And of course, you can fully help a woman give birth on Shabbat. You can call a midwife for her from place to place. You can violate Shabbat, and you can tie the umbilical cord. Rabbi Yossi Omer, you can cut the umbilical cord, Rabbi Yossi says. And all the necessities of Brit Milah you can do on Shabbat. So now, and that's actually going to be a segue into the next parak, by the way, because the next parak is going to be about Brit Milah. Yeah. So the Gemara says, what does it mean that you can support the animal but you can't birth the animal. You can't deliver the actual baby, in other words, but you can help the animal along. So Rabbi Yehuda Amar ochezet havelad shelo tipol la'aretz, that when the baby comes out, you can catch the baby. Rav Nachman Amar dochek bo basar kedei sheyetze havelad. He says that you can massage the animal's belly so that the baby comes out. Okay, so either way, you're not directly delivering it. You're not pulling out the baby from within the animal's womb, but you are assisting the process in one way or another. Rav Nachman Amar dochek. Right. So Tanya Kevetet Rav Yehuda, we have a Baraita that supports Rav Yehuda. Ketzad Misa'adin. How do you help? How do you support? Ochazin et havalat shelo yipol la'aretz. You can catch the baby when it comes out. V'nofeach lo b'chotamo. You can clear out the mucus from its nose. V'noten lo dad l'toch piv kedei sheyinak. And you can also put its mouth to its mother's what's it called? Udder, right? The udder, so that it can immediately start nursing. So you assist everything except actually extracting the baby. So you can catch the baby, clean it up a little bit. Take out the mucus from its nose so it can breathe, and you can bring it so that it can eat from its mother right away. We used to mirachamin, give compassion to the kosher animals on Yom Tov. What does he mean? Hechi avid. What did they do? Amar Rabbi Abai says, Mevi bul shel melach b'toch harechem. What they would do is they would take a handful of salt and put it inside the womb, which would burn. So she would remember the pain of childbirth, and she would have mercy on her offspring. Okay, so doesn't seem like very nice, but they wanted to remember. And they would put the afterbirth onto the baby so that the mother would smell it and have mercy on the baby. In other words, to create bonding. In other words, like today, what they do with human infants, as soon as the baby's born, they put it on the mother. Mm-hmm. All dirty and everything, they put it on the mother right away. So that's like a bonding thing. So that's what they would do, some kind of bonding thing. Now Rashi says that they would actually soak the afterbirth in water and then put the water on the baby. Rambam says they actually just put the afterbirth directly on the baby. Whatever the case may be, it's a way to can create a bond. But they would only do this for the animals that were kosher, not the non-kosher ones. What's the reason? Because a non-kosher animal will not reject its offspring. They don't have bonding issues. And if they do have issues, there's no resolving it. Okay, it's like there's Sfaradim basically. There's Sfaradim. So if they have a fight, forget it.
Get it.
Right? They don't have fight. They love each other.
It's hopeless.
They love each other, but if there's a fight, yeah. So that's what the Gemara says. So now, miyaladina taisha, we can help. We can deliver a human baby. Michti. Let's see. Tanale miyaladina taisha. So we already said you can deliver the baby, and you can summon a midwife from place to place. So what is the phrase you can violate Shabbat for her come to add? I mean, what's new? Obviously, if you're delivering the baby, you're calling people from place to place and all that. You're already transgressing the laws of Shabbat. So, what is the chidush in the line mechalelin aleyat Shabbat that you violate Shabbat? La'atuye hadatanu Rabbanan. It's to include the following: Imhayta tzricha laner chaverta madleket la'taner, v'imhayta tzricha l'shemen chaverta meviala shemen bayad, v'imeno sipek bayad mevi'a b'sa'ara. Then mivi'ala b'kli. So it says that they can light a candle for her. If she needs oil, her friend brings oil in her hand. If there's not enough to fit in her hand, right? In other words, her hand can't hold enough. So then she brings it in her hair. If she can't bring it in her hair, she brings it in a vessel. So we're going to see. So Amar, the master said, isn't it obvious if they needed a candle to be able to see? Obviously they have to light a candle on Shabbat. What are they going to do in the dark? What's the chidush? So the Gemara says that the answer is lo tzricha b'sumah. Even if the woman's blind, you can still light a candle. Why? What's the reason? Kevan de la chazia asur. You might think, well, she can't see anyway, so what difference does it make to her? So the answer is, she will feel better. Because she'll feel, as long as there's light, if there's anything going wrong, my friend will see and help me. In other words, she wants there to be light. It's not for the woman directly to be able to see, but it's for whoever's helping her to be able to see, that it gives her peace of mind to know that people can see what's going on. We'll just do a little tiny bit more. So if she needed oil could be brought in the hand or in the hair. So what do you mean she's going to bring oil in her hair? That makes no sense. She's going to put oil in her hair, she's going to have to squeeze out her hair anyway. You don't want to do that anyway. That's another violation on top of a violation. Why doesn't she just carry it in a vessel already? Rabban Rav Yosef say that just shows you that squeezing out your hair is not a violation of Shabbat, which we don't agree with, by the way. It is considered a violation of Shabbat. Rav Ashi says afilu tema yesh schita b'se'ar mevi'ah la kli bechli derech sa'ara dekamad efshad shanuye mishaninan. That what the Rav Ashi says, even if there is an issue of squeezing out from the hair, still we do the best we can to do things in an unusual way. So she puts the vessel of oil in her hair rather than carry it in her hand. So she's doing it in an unusual way. But if it's impossible for her to do that, she just carries it. I won't be able to do it, but Boaz will do it. He can, because he has long hair. He can tie the kli in there. It's an unusual way of doing it. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel says Chaya kol zman she'akever patuach. Kever, ironically, is a term for the womb, even though it brings life. It's called kever. Yeah. So as long as the womb is open and the baby's coming out, ben amrat tzrichani, ben lo amrat tzrichani, mechalilin alei Shabbat. That whether she says I need help or she doesn't say anything, we violate Shabbat to help deliver the baby. However, nistama kever, once the birth is over, ben amrat tzrichani, ben lo amrat tzrichani, and mechalilin alei Shabbat. Even if she says I need help, we don't violate Shabbat anymore because we assume she's okay, that the emergency is past. Rav Ashi matnehachi, that was Rav Ashi's version. Mar Zutra matnehachi, Mar Zutra had a different version. That Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Chaya kol zman she'akever patuach, ben amra tzrichani, uven amra en tzrichani, mechalin alei Shabbat. Two differences here. Number one, when she's giving birth, even if she says, I don't want you to violate the Shabbat, I don't need it, we still do it. In the first version it was, whether she said she needed it or she didn't say anything, we assume she needed it. Second version, even if she says I don't need it, we still assume she needs it. She doesn't know what's going on. Nistama kever, as soon as the birth is over, amrat tzrichani mechalin alei Shabbat, lo amrat tzrichani en mechalin alei Shabbat. If she says, in other words, once the birth is over, if she says I need it, then we still violate the Shabbat for her. We assume she knows her body. Okay? If she doesn't say anything, then we assume she also doesn't.
Assuming there is a need for it, you're not going to do it just down.
Well, the question is, when do we? So the conclusion is, Amar le Ravina. Ravina said, Lemaremar Mar Zutra matnei lekulav, Rav Ashi matnei lechumra. So Mar Zutra here teaches one way, teaches lekula. He teaches a lenient version. Rav Ashi was more stringent because Rav Ashi says she has to explicitly ask for you to violate Shabbat when she's giving birth. And once the birth is over and the womb is closed, even if she asks for it, we don't do it. Mar Zutra says she doesn't have to say anything when she's giving birth. She can even say no and we still do it. And he says that once the birth is over, we still will do it if she needs it, if she requests some kind of intervention. So what does the halacha follow? So hilchita keman. Amar le halacha kemar zutra. Why? Safek nefashot lehakel. Because a doubt about saving a life, we are lenient. So it's a famous story about a rabbi who said that they asked him, how come you're so lenient about matters of violating Shabbat? For sickness, for birth, for Yom Kippur, you're very lenient about whom you allow to eat on Yom Kippur. He said, I'm not lenient about Shabbat, I'm not lenient about Yom Kippur. I'm machmir about pikuach nefesh. I'm very stringent about saving life. And that's really what the Gemara is saying. The safek nefashot, if it's a matter of life and death, we always rule leniently rather than stringently because we don't want to take any chances with life and death. Shabbat shalom.